Beneath the earth lie secrets that challenge everything we think we know about our ancestors and their darkest fears. In this episode, I'm going to take you through two cases that prove our ancestors used something terrifying that we've forgotten and took extreme measures to protect themselves. You won't want to miss this one. In the summer of 1650, a young woman named Zosiah lay on what would become her deathbed in a small village overlooking the Vistula River Valley in Poland. She was only 17 years old and she had been sick for weeks now. Her chest hurt constantly from this growth that had formed inside her sternum. This thing made it hard for her to breathe sometimes. It was hard for her to even move without pain shooting through her body. But what terrified her more than the physical pain was the way people in her village had started looking at her. These were people she had known her whole life. Neighbors who used to smile at her, children who used to play near her family's home, and now they crossed themselves whenever they saw her, and they would whisper things behind her back. Ultimately, they kept their distance and she just couldn't understand why. She could tell something had shifted a few weeks ago when her illness became noticeable. Now, initially, people were sympathetic. They brought her family food, offered prayers for her recovery, but something changed. The sympathy turned to suspicion. The prayers turned to whispering and gossip, and whatever it is that gossip contained spread to the village. And now, as she lay there struggling to breathe, she could hear voices outside her home. Lots of them. And it sounded like half the village had actually gathered and they were discussing something urgent. Something that clearly involved her. She tried to listen, but she could only catch fragments and she was just too ill to bring herself to sit up to listen closer. It was something about protection. At least that's what she could make out. Something about the safety of children. Her mother sat beside her bed and she could see that she had been crying. So when Zaya tried to ask what was happening, her mother just shook her head and squeezed her hand tighter. That's when she realized that whatever was being discussed outside, her own family wasn't arguing against it. They seemed to have accepted it, that whatever it was. And just then, the door slammed open, and several men from the village entered, and she recognized them all. There was the blacksmith who had always been kind to her, the farmers whose fields bordered her family's land, and the merchant who had sold beautiful fabrics at the market, including the silk headdress with gold thread that she had saved for months to buy. But none of them would meet her eyes. One of the men spoke quietly to her mother, who had nodded and stood up, releasing her hand. And that's when Zosiah tried to sit up and tried to protest, but like I told you guys, she was just too drained. It was obvious at this point, the growth in her chest sent stabbing pains through her body that literally crippled her. The men approached her bed, and Zosiah saw that the blacksmith was carrying items that she didn't recognize. There was this large curved blade that kind of looked like a sickle, the kind used for harvesting grain, and then there was something else. It was a metal, but the gleam was caught in the candlelight. It appeared to be a lock of some kind, triangular in shape, but unlike any she'd ever seen. This is when she began to panic. She knew that this was not going to end well. And why had they brought them to her room? She looked over desperate at her mother, but she had turned away and was crying, her shoulders shaking with sobs. And that's when she understood what was going to happen. She was going to die. Not just from her illness, but something else was going to happen. Something the entire village had decided needed to happen. And these strange objects were somehow a part of it. Even as all this is going on, she wanted to scream and beg them to explain what she had done wrong. Why were they treating her like this? But when she opened her mouth, all that came out was this weak cough that brought the taste of copper. She had been tasting copper for days now, ever since the growth in her chest had gotten worse. And the men were gentle as they lifted her from her bed, and she even noticed that these men had brought a cart, and they gently placed her on it. Almost reverently, her mother approached and then placed something under Zosiah's head. A pillow, which was very soft and familiar, but it was such a strange gesture of comfort in the middle of whatever nightmare was unfolding. and they wheeled her out of the house, and that's when she truly got a scope of everything. The entire village had gathered for this event. Women held their children close, men stood with these really grim expressions, and everybody just watched in this silence as the cart made its way up the hill towards the village cemetery. Now, this particular area where she was being taken to wasn't a normal cemetery. They weren't taking her to the consecrated ground where her grandparents were buried or where the priest said prayers and crosses marked the graves. They were taking her to the other place, the older place on the far side of the hill where people talked about a different energy. The journey seemed to take forever, and each bump in the road, pain just shot through her chest, and she could feel herself getting weaker and her breathing getting more shallow. And part of her wondered if she would even make it to wherever they were taking her, if she would die right here on this cart, surrounded by people who had suddenly become strangers. She could feel that whatever illness was in her was just taking hold of her life force. And when they finally stopped, she could see that they had prepared a grave. It was already dug, waiting for her. And now, the men were bringing those strange metal objects closer. The blacksmith knelt beside the cart, and he actually looked at her then, like really looked at her, and Josiah could see something like regret in his eyes. And he spoke to her very softly, and he told her that this was for the good of everybody, that it wasn't what they wanted, it wasn't personal, and they were sorry that it had to be this way. But of course, he never explained what this way meant or why it was necessary. At this point, she was far too weak to even respond and say anything, so all she could really do was just lie there as they prepared whatever ritual this was. They then moved her from the cart to the ground beside the grave, and that's when they began positioning these objects. The sickle, that curved blade, they placed it across her neck. Now, not cutting her, they didn't hurt her, they just laid it down, kind of like a barrier of some kind. The weight of it made it even harder to breathe, but she was so beyond panic at this point. She was just confused, she was heartbroken, and of course, during this entire event, she felt like she was dying, or at least in the last throes of her life. They then took this triangular lock, and with gentleness, they attached it to her left big toe. And she could even hear it as it clicked into place, and she's like wondering, why on earth are they doing this? What is this? What are they trying to prevent? And so then they just gently lowered her into the grave, and Josiah's last coherent thought was about her headdress, the beautiful silk one with the gold thread. She had worn it today because somehow she had known this was important, that whatever was happening required her to look her best. The last thing she saw was all these faces peering down at her from above. Faces full of fear, but also sadness. Whatever they thought she was, whatever they believed she might become, it was clear they didn't want to do this, but they were doing it anyway. And then the dirt began to fall, and then Josiah knew no more. Fast forward all the way to August of 2022. A professor by the name of Dariusz Polinsky from Nicolaus Copernicus University was leading his archaeology team through their excavation located in Pien, Poland. They had been working at this site on the hill overlooking the Vistula River Valley for several weeks, and they had already uncovered dozens of graves. But this cemetery was really strange. Professor Polinsky had excavated many historical cemeteries all throughout Poland, but he had never seen anything quite like this. For one thing, there were no Catholic icons anywhere, no religious symbols or crosses, and the burial practices they were uncovering were, to put it mildly, unusual. His team included some of the best in their fields. There was Magdalena Zagrodzka, whose expertise in historical burial practices was virtually unmatched, Lukas Czyzewski, who specialized in medieval archaeology, and Dr. Alicja Drozd-Limska, whose work in bioarchaeology would prove crucial for understanding what they were about to find. Now, they had already uncovered about 50 burials that showed what they called deviant characteristics. Some bodies had stones placed on top of them, and others were buried face down. A few were in positions that suggested that they had been bound before burial. So it was clear that whoever was buried in the cemetery The people who buried them were afraid of something. And on this morning, they were working on grave number 75. And as they carefully removed the soil, layer by layer, Magdalena was the first to notice something metallic catching the morning sunlight. And so she called out to the others, and they all gathered around as they continued to expose what appeared to be a large curved piece of iron. As more soil was removed, they realized it was a sickle. A farming tool, but it wasn't lying beside the body or placed in the hands as grave goods sometimes were. It was positioned very deliberately across the neck of the skeleton. Professor Polinsky felt his pulse quicken at this sight because he had read about this in historical texts but had never seen it in person. This was a very specific burial practice, one with a very specific purpose. But he kept his thoughts to himself for the moment, wanting to see what else the grave would reveal. And as they continued excavating, they found the skeleton was that of a young woman. The bones were remarkably well preserved. Dr. Dreslimska estimated that based on the pelvic structure and other markers that she had been around 17 when she died. They all began working carefully around the feet of the skeleton and uncovered a strange metal object. Turns out it was a padlock, triangular in shape and unlike anything they typically found in 17th century Polish graves. But even stranger, the padlock was attached to the woman's left big toe, and it was open. As they continued to expose the full skeleton, more strange details emerged. The woman was buried with care, that much they could see, and there was an outline of what had been a pillow beneath her skull. She wore what appeared to have been an expensive silk headdress with traces of gold or silver thread still visible. This wasn't a criminal or an outcast thrown hastily into the ground. This was someone who had been loved, someone whose burial had been very important. Everything pointed to one thing. In 17th century Poland, these items served a very specific purpose. The sickle across the neck was meant to decapitate the corpse if it tried to rise from the grave. The padlock on the toe was meant to bind the person to their grave to prevent them from walking the earth again. This young woman had been buried as a vampire, or more accurately, as what 17th century Poles would have called, I cannot pronounce the actual way this is said in Polish, but it's Strzyga.
Strzyga.
One of the returning dead. Carbon dating of her remains would later confirm that she was buried at approximately 1650, right in the middle of a very tumultuous period in the Polish history when the Swedish invasions had brought war, disease, and death to the entire region. It was a time when fear of the supernatural ran high and when communities looked for explanations for the tragedies befalling them. Those who lived near the excavation site had taken to calling the skeleton Zosia, which is a common Polish nickname for girls, and I probably butchered that name too, but I'm not Polish, so bear with me. After an extensive medical examination was done, it was revealed that she had suffered from hemangioma, which is a benign tumor in her sternum, which this would have been the cause of her significant pain and might have created a visible swelling on her chest. But even more interesting was when the DNA of her skeleton was tested and it revealed that she actually had Scandinavian ancestry. During the Swedish invasions, being a Scandinavian would have made her an outsider, someone viewed with suspicion. She hadn't been born in a village. She had come from somewhere else, possibly from Scandinavia itself. The point of all this information is because at this time, 1650 or around there, she could have been viewed as something supernatural, that the signs and medical issues that she was facing led many to believe that she was a vampire. And in fact, they were not done excavating that area. That same team discovered others. In fact, just 1.5 meters from her grave, there was a child around 7 years old, buried face down with almost the same situation, and in a nearby pit, they found the remains of other children. In total, there was over 50 of the approximately 100 graves in the cemetery showed these strange burial practices. Whatever was happening in this village in the 1650s, it had driven them to extraordinary measures. In the summer of 1966, an archaeologist named Jack D. Eaton was trudging through the dense jungle of southeastern Mexico. He was in the state of Campeche on the Yucatan Peninsula, and he was there as a part of this big joint study between National Geographic and a university. They were planning to do this major archaeological excavation of an ancient Mayan city called Unkown. But before they could start digging, they needed Jack to survey the area to make sure they weren't missing anything important. And so for days, he had been hacking his way through the thick vegetation with his small team, and they would map out the terrain and taking all the notes they needed, basically doing all the unglamorous groundwork that comes before any of these big digs. It was hot, it was humid, and Jack wasn't expecting to find much. His job was just to make sure there wasn't anything else in the immediate vicinity that they should know about. But on this morning, him and his team were about 1.25 miles west of the city when they noticed the ground beneath their feet was starting to rise, and they were walking up what seemed to be a natural elevation like a small hill. And as any archaeologist will tell you, when you're in ancient Mayan territory and you find a hill, you pay attention. Because the Maya, they like to build on high ground. It gave them strategic advantages, better drainage, all sorts of practical benefits. So Jack and his team start climbing, pushing through the undergrowth, and after maybe about 20 minutes, they reach what seems to be the top. Initially, it looks to be just more jungle, but one of his assistants calls out and points to something that's partially hidden by vines and just centuries of plant growth. It's a solid stone structure. And not just a pile of rocks, but clearly something that was built by hands. And so Jack is getting excited, his heart's racing. This is exactly the kind of thing they're trained to look for. And as they begin very carefully clearing away some of the vegetation, there isn't just one. There are multiple, and they're all constructed in a very specific architectural style that he immediately recognizes. It's called Riobek, and it's the same style at Unkown and other classic period Mayan sites in this region. And so over the next several hours, Jack and his team work to get a better sense of what they've found. It becomes clear that this is an entire settlement, a small Mayan city that's been swallowed up by the jungle and forgotten. The buildings are all in various states of decay, but they're substantial structures made of carefully cut limestone. And out of all these structures, something grabs his attention, and it's located in the eastern section of what appears to be a small square or plaza. As he approaches it, clearing away more of the vegetation, he realizes he's looking at an entrance, a doorway into a structure. The entire portal has been carved and shaped to look like something very specific, and as more of it is revealed, he can hardly believe it. The doorway is designed to look like the open mouth of an enormous serpent. Now, to understand why this was such a big deal, you have to know a little bit about Mayan culture. Serpents were hugely important in their mythology. They represented the connection between earth and the sky, between the physical world and the spiritual one. And one serpent deity in particular, Itzamna, was considered one of the most powerful in their pantheon. But what Jack is looking at isn't just a symbolic representation. The ancient Maya who built this, probably around 700 BC, based on the construction techniques, they had gone to great lengths to make this doorway look as realistic as possible. The lintel above the door and the threshold below are carved to look like rows of teeth, and on either side of the entrance, spiral designs represent its eyes. And the entire facade of the building curves and undulates to suggest the serpent's body. But here's what really got to him as he stood there looking. To enter, you literally had to walk into the mouth of the serpent. You had to pass between its teeth, under its eyes. And for ancient Maya who used this structure, the act of entering would have been deeply symbolic. It would have been like being swallowed by the deity, passing from the ordinary world into the sacred space within. So Jack spends the rest of the day documenting the structure, which he designates as Structure 2 in his notes. He realizes that this wasn't some minor outpost. This was a thriving settlement that existed during the classic period of Mayan civilization. And based on some of the other buildings he's seen, like the serpent, for example, was built even earlier. Jack would later determine that this city once reached its peak power of influence around 300 AD, making it one of the earliest major settlements in the entire region. And it would have housed thousands of people. And for some reason, around the year 1100, the city was abandoned. People left, and the jungle began its slow work of reclamation. What's interesting is this city was only about 2 kilometers or just over a mile from Pecan. The two cities would have been inhabited at the same time. They even shared the same architectural style. They probably traded with each other, maybe even fought with each other. Jack was given the honor of naming this establishment. And even today, you yourself can go here and visit this site. The ancient city that Jack discovered is known as Chicana, or Mouth of the Serpent. And because you guys made it this far into the episode, I want you to all comment below, supernatural. So that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy this kind of content where we dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. As always, never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.